All right, so welcome to this morning's session all about scientific writing. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jill, and I'm a learning specialist here at the library. This is hooked up. Yeah. Just before we get into the content of today's session, a quick reminder of the various writing and communication support that is available at the library. So of course we have workshops and we have workshop recordings. We also have the Writing Help Center. And if you're not familiar with the Writing Help Center, I always encourage folks to try it once, to sit down with a tutor or submit your work to a tutor and go through that process of receiving feedback from a very invested reader, a reader who is invested but also doesn't have power over you, to get that sense of how a reader is actually engaging with your work. It is so useful to our development as writers to go through that process on a regular basis. But what I say is try it once, determine if it's been helpful, and if it's been helpful, then you have the choice to keep going back. If you find that it's not that helpful, at least you tried it and decided that it wasn't for you. But I'm a big fan of writing centers, and I encourage everyone to connect. We also have English as an additional language support programming that runs throughout the year, and we have different events, activities that run throughout the year as well. So in the month of June, for instance, I've been running productivity sessions. Basically, we get together either in person or on Zoom in order to benefit from being around people who are also working, because sometimes, our attention can start to wander. It can be easy to procrastinate on our work. I am a champion procrastinator. And so that's one of the reasons I do run those sessions, because I'm always getting my own work done at the same time. But if you want to reach out to me, you can send me an email at jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. I'm always very, very happy to hear from folks and to answer your questions to the best of my abilities. Okay, so this is our agenda for this morning. We're going to chat a little bit about the principles of scientific writing, and then we're going to focus on a range of strategies for helping to improve our clarity when writing. So we're going to talk about topic sentences, reducing subject length, using concrete language, creating flow, and writing more concisely. And then there are a whole host of resources that you might want to explore that are available primarily online, because one of the great things about talking about scientific writing is discovering that there are a lot of people who are deeply invested in ensuring that we are communicating clearly in our disciplines, because we need to communicate our very complex ideas in a way that other people can understand. Because this kind of speaks to the principles of scientific writing, right? We want people to understand the complexity of our work in a way that they are able to follow along, and that they can believe in the science that people have been carrying out. And we're also interested in notions of transparency and reproducibility. Now, you might be familiar with the concept of the crisis of reproducibility in certain science disciplines, because sometimes it's difficult for scientists to reproduce the work of other scientists, or they just don't have the time or resources to carry that out. But when we write as clearly as possible, that's going to help with that potential reproducibility, because people will be able to carry out the work in a similar manner. Okay, so when it comes to approaching our writing, we are going to ask ourselves a lot of different questions. And this is one of the reasons why writing is such a complex process, because we're having to balance questions in our mind all the time. We begin with our reader. Who am I writing for? Who is going to be reading this? What information do they already have? What kind of knowledge do they already possess? What kind of information will they need to know? And so we're always going to have to apply our discernment in terms of deciding what kind of detail we're going to capture for those readers. If we're writing for a more interdisciplinary audience, for instance, we might have to be even more aware of context. So we might have to provide some more detail or explanation as opposed to a group of readers who might already share a lot of that knowledge base. Why are the purpose? Why are you sharing the results of your work in the first place? What do you want people to do with this information? So we want to think about the intent for sharing out the work in the first place. What kind of genre conventions do we have to be aware of? Are there certain structures that you are expected to follow? Now, in a lot of scientific writing contexts, there's often going to be certain expectations of the structure that you're going to follow. So the very classic example is that introduction, literature review, methods, results, discussion. And so that gives us a broad model to follow. But then when we think about overall organization, how do we organize content within those sections? So we might have a broad structure, but then how are we going to organize the information within those structures? Are we going to think in terms of themes or chronology, research methods, et cetera, et cetera? And then notions of style. What kind of style or tone is expected? What kind of vocabulary are you expected to use in order to demonstrate your belonging to that group of readers that you're writing for? What about flow? How are you going to ensure that the reading experience is actually going to be quite smooth for your readers, so they're not getting confused or they're not sort of pausing and having to reread? And this connects, of course, to the last point of readability. So how can you ensure that people can read the work in a fairly easy to follow manner? So it can be a little bit overwhelming, right? We have to have all of these questions in mind. And this is before we're even thinking about the content that we're writing about, which is often quite complex. So I'm never someone who says like, oh, writing is simple, you just do this, this, and this. I'm all about recognizing, wow, this is a highly complex cognitive process that we need to create some dedicated time and space to develop. So why are we so fixated on our readers when we are writing? Well, I think this quote captures it. It's quite old. It's from the 90s, so vintage, right? But I think it really captures why we begin and end with thinking of our reader. It does not matter how pleased an author might be to have converted all the right data into sentences and paragraphs. It matters only whether a large majority of the reading audience accurately perceives what the author had in mind, right? Because writing is a proxy for trying to transfer our thoughts to the mind of someone else. It's a remarkable thing that collectively humans have developed. Like writing is an amazing invention because it is one of the ways in which we can try to share what's in our mind with other people. Okay, so now we're going to start thinking as a reader. And there's not going to be any right or wrong answers to these questions. And we're going to be looking at several different examples throughout the session. What I'm curious about is your reaction as a reader and helping you to sort of go through that reflective process to figure out, okay, if I am preferring one piece of writing over another, what might be accounting for that preference? So here we have two pieces of writing, and I'm curious which version do people prefer? So you can make use of the chat to pop in one of the numbers, or I'll just say one or two in the room and people can put up their hands. So the first example reads as follows. Remote sensing technology is widely used in river ice research, in which safety concerns prevent the use of direct measurements. One remote sensing technology is RadarSat-2, a satellite used by researchers to obtain geospatial information. Using RadarSat-2, researchers can document the spring melt of lake ice, showing different breakup initiation dates. RadarSat-2 also helps them to determine ice thickening rates and to track differences in polarization backscatter, a process used to discriminate lake ice from open water. Okay, version 2. The utilization of remote sensing technology in river ice research, a field in which significant safety concerns play a role in the prevention of the use of direct measurements, has become widespread. Geospatial information can be obtained through the use of a satellite, which is known as RadarSat-2. The documentation of different initiation dates of ice on freshwater lakes during the melt of lake ice in spring can be achieved through the utilization of this important technology. The tracking of differences in polarization backscatter, which is a procedure that can be of assistance in the process of discriminating lake ice from open water, is another use of RadarSat-2. The determination of the rates of ice thickening can also be made through the use of RadarSat-2. So take a moment, feel free to read back through each example. And if you're tuning in from online, you can just pop in your preference in the chat, 1 or 2, and in a moment, I'll just ask for hands up in the room. This is where anonymous polling is the best, but difficult to do in a hybrid environment. So in the room, I'll just ask 1 or 2 and we'll see hands. And if you're tuning in from online, feel free to keep popping in your preferences. So preference for 1. Okay, preference for 2. So in the room, the majority, if you're not seeing this, the majority are preferring 1, but not universally. And we're seeing an emerging preference for 2. And it's always really interesting to go through this process because you'll see that with certain examples, there will be trends that emerge, and sometimes you'll have a universal response, but often it's a little bit mixed, right? And that's the value in going through these types of exercises, I think, because we start to realize that we might look at writing through certain lenses, but there's always going to be a little bit of subjectivity in terms of those preferences. So let's take a closer look at how these pieces of text align with each other. Though if anyone wants to speak to their preference, I'm very curious to hear why. We have some context provided in the chat indicating the preference for 2 because they identify more information here. And then we have preference for 1, it's more concise, to the point, and there's reference to the citation as well. Anyone in the room want to explain their preference?
I'm going to agree that 1 is more concise and to the point, because 2, it feels a little unwieldy, and like it uses the sentence, can be of assistance in the process of discriminating lake ice from open water. It's like that is, it feels like it provides more information, but it actually doesn't. It's just longer words that are harder to parse in multiple like steps when you can just say what the previous one said.
Yeah, and it's also a very interesting experience reading aloud both examples, because as a reader, when you're actually reading something aloud, you can become more attuned, especially if you have longer sentences, because it's like, at what point can I take a breath? Right? And that sometimes gives you insight. And I tend to be a wordy writer myself. And when I'm revising my work, sometimes I will just read stuff aloud because I'll start to recognize, Jill, you're starting to get a little bit wordy. We need to rein that in. So when we compare these pieces of text, arguably, when we look at that first version, clear topic sentence, shorter subjects, less abstract, arguably a stronger flow, and more concise. And that's something that we've made reference to a little bit, right? That sense of conciseness in the first one. In the second version, slightly more convoluted topic sentence, longer subjects, a bit more abstract, arguably a weaker flow, though notions of flow can be a bit more subjective and a little bit more wordy. So this is actually going to guide a lot of our reflection today. We're going to consider the role of topic sentences. We're going to look at how we can improve our sentence structures. We're going to look at how we might reduce abstraction, how we might create flow, and also some strategies for writing more concisely. And we're going to do this through a lot of reader reflection. We're going to look at a lot of different examples of text. So our next example. So this is from an article entitled "Top-Down Control of Species Distributions, Feral Cats Driving the Regional Extinction of a Threatened Rodent in Northern Australia." And so our first example reads as follows. Over the past 2 decades, robust evidence demonstrating the significant impact of feral cats on Australian native mammals has emerged. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrated that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in Northern Australia. Example 2. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrated that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in Northern Australia. So, take a moment, reflect. What is your preference when looking at 1 and 2? So some folks are starting to indicate in the chat, and I'll just open it up to the room. So, preference for 1, preference for 2, a split and an undecided, right? And I'm not surprised. So if you preferred the first example, what might be accounting for your preference? Yes.
First, between the two, I believe they're both the exact same, except for the starting sentence, and I felt it added more context to the situation.
I think it kind of depends on what the important part of it is. Is the time frame really critical to your understanding? If it was part of a larger conversation, then yes. If it was just the point was cats are a problem, then no.
So, because context is always going to drive our decisions as writers, right? We're always making that decision. What information does my reader require? If you preferred the second example, what might be accounting for that preference?
The time frame just doesn't add to the point, if that is really the point.
So it might be like, oh, maybe I don't need all that extra context, right? And sometimes I'm like, sometimes I get concerned that having this example immediately after the previous example is almost sending mixed messages, right? Because some of the preference for our previous example really centered on this notion of conciseness. And here we're looking at situations where it's like, well, this one is obviously more, the second example is obviously more concise. But I think there's some value here when we look at the information that this relatively short sentence is achieving. Because depending on where this information would appear in a text, it might be providing some very useful context in a relatively small word count. And you have to make these decisions all the time when you are constructing your paragraphs. What do I need my topic sentence of a paragraph to achieve? And when we look at this particular example, it's a pretty short topic sentence, but it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. We have the introduction to the topic itself. We have a little bit of the research context. We have a temporal context, and we also have a geographic context, right? And we wouldn't otherwise have this information until we got to the last sentence, because the sentence that follows doesn't get into that geographic context, for instance. And we would perhaps have some of that context because we would have looked at the title of the article, for instance, but we always want to figure out what kind of framing will be useful for my reader. If this kind of information is appearing later in a document, you might not need this kind of context in the topic sentence because your readers will already have that. So we're always having to sort of figure out, do I need a little bit of detail? Do I need a little bit of framing in my topic sentence to make the information that follows make sense for my readers? Okay. All right. Yes.
I actually kind of like that you have those two side by side, where
Mhm.
like the previous one was like context and like conciseness,
Mhm.
and this one has like the topic sentences.
Mhm.
Because it highlights, I think, an important difference between like conciseness and like the information content. If
Mhm.
you just cut information content, it's not it's not more concise.
Yeah.
It's kind of conciseness is the same information in less words.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that actually is a good thing to highlight.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think notions of word count are not synonymous with conciseness. It's about ensuring that the same information is just delivered in a way that might be more easily read by our audience. Yeah. But I have noticed this trend in the past, because we'll be talking about conciseness and then I'll see we look at this example and people are like, oh, well, she likes short things, so we'll say it too. And the purpose of these kind of exercises is not to please me. I'm just a reader like anyone else. What I'm here to do is to just illustrate trends and to get people to reflect on their reading preferences and what might be accounting for them. All right, let's continue. Which do you prefer, one or two? So the first example, the evolution of human behaviors through the adaptation of people to the new and changing conditions of hydrological systems due to climate change suggests that a continuous reassessment of water demand models is necessary. Example 2, as hydrological systems evolve in response to climate change, humans adapt to these new conditions. To monitor how changing human behavior impacts water systems, researchers need to continually reassess water demand models. Let's take a moment to reflect on preference. You can share in the chat, and in a moment, I will poll the room. All right, so we see some preferences emerging in the chat. Now I'll poll the room. Preference for one? Preference for two? Universal. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is exciting. So what is accounting for this preference?
The first one just leads you to think that this is some kind of biology thing, human adaptation. And then the second part just resituates the whole mind.
So it's a little bit more direct, potentially, less I think one of the well, I'll just pause. Any other reasons for preferences? Yes.
I found them to be easier to understand whenever the information was like broken up. Kind of digest one thing and then the next.
So we're looking at the difference of having one longer sentence versus two shorter ones.
I was gonna say similar, but it feels like a run-on sentence and the sentence structure, like the second one kind of flips the information the other way, which just makes it more understandable.
You kind of ran out of breath reading the first line.
That might be speaking to my lung capacity more than anything
No, I
else.
would have run out of breath too. It's crazy. That's a long sentence.
I was trying not to give it away. But yeah, so just as a sidebar, has anyone ever studied a language like German? Okay, I took a year of German as an undergrad, and the reason I didn't continue was, even though I was enjoying it, toward the end of that first year, the sentences started to look like that first sentence, and you wouldn't actually understand what the sentence was about until you got to the end of the sentence. So the cognitive load for reading German was much higher than that of English, which I found very interesting, but I also knew maybe I won't continue this as a minor. So we're seeing some, well, quite universal preference for that second example. So a couple of things are accounting for that preference, right? We've made reference to just that difference between the sentence length. It's easier to understand slightly shorter sentences sometimes. And we also have an instance where we have shorter subjects. So the distinction between like the doer of the action and the action itself is reduced in our second example. And so that can just make it easier for us to understand what's going on, because otherwise we have to parse out a lot of detail in order to actually understand the purpose of the sentence in that first example. All right, so let's continue. This is from an article entitled Growth of Graphene from Food, Insects, and Waste, and it reads as follows. Example 1. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources, such as food, insects, and waste, can be used without purification to grow high-quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. For food, a Girl Scout cookie and chocolate were investigated. For waste with low or negative monetary value, we use bulk polystyrene plastic, a common solid waste, blades of grass, and dog feces. For insects, another often negative value carbon source, a cockroach leg was used. Example 2. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources can be used without purification to grow high-quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. All right, so let's take a moment. What is your preference as a reader? What might be accounting for this preference? We have one response in the chat so far. In a moment, I'll poll the room. All right, so to the room, preference for one. Okay, universal in the room. What's accounting for this preference? If you want to contribute in the chat, feel free to do so. So what's accounting for that preference for the first example?
Considering these like examples kind of isolated in a vacuum, I prefer one because it actually provides, I think this is quite important information, because food comes in a wide variety of things, and knowing what they used, it provides very important context. I do want to say, however, I'm only leaning towards one because two would be acceptable if there was a table underneath it. And so that contains the same information. I think that information is important to get across, but it's just absent of two.
Yeah, and I like that you've brought up reference to a table, right? Because in a lot of scientific communication contexts, you're going to have information that's expressed in other forms, be it a table, be it some sort of visualization. And it's about balancing sometimes the prose versus that kind of information. And again, you're also speaking to the role of context, right? This has just been lifted. So we are looking at writing from outside of its context, which is a little bit of an artificial exercise. Like I fully recognize that. So any other reasons why we're preferring 1 to 2? Just that level of detail?
Yeah. Without further context, the
Yeah.
second one isn't useful.
All right, so again, and this is trying to recognize that our readers are going to need certain detail in order to understand what we are doing. And when we're looking at this example in particular, we're also seeing an instance where we have a lot of concrete language. So if you're not familiar with the concept of concrete language, this refers to language that captures things that can be sensed, whether through sight, through touch, through taste, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to you is, well, what might be a benefit of concrete language? Why might readers like having access to this kind of vocabulary as opposed to more abstract language?
Well, it grounds the sentence kind of in, I guess, the world in broader context. I know what a Girl Scout cookie is, and so it kind of adds a lot more groundwork for like what they're actually doing. Like, what does this look like? And so I can imagine it better.
Imagine, right? This is activating our ability to imagine and perceive. We are all, I mean, philosophers will have different points of view of this, but we all live in a pretty solid, tangible world. And this is what we have access to from the time we are born. Whereas writing operates on a more symbolic, abstract level. And so concrete language is a way to ground or unify these different planes of existence, shall we say. So when we really want to make sure that readers can perceive, we want to be mindful of the benefits of concrete language, because this will help to activate their awareness of how the world exists and how they exist in it, or how the information that you're sharing with them exists within it. So you might not even be that familiar with a particular brand of cookies, but a lot of people will have some familiarity with cookies, blade of grass, cockroach. I specifically did not include an image of dog feces. And when I read that, I just was like, oh, scientists, like you're always getting up to something, right? But concrete language really helps with that centering of information in a way that's just easier for people to perceive and understand. All right, we're zipping through. Let's look at our next example. Which do you prefer? Farmers try to provide optimal growing conditions for crops by using soil additives to adjust soil pH. Garden lime or agricultural limestone is made from pulverized chalk and can be used to raise the pH of the soil. Clay soil, which is naturally acidic, often requires addition of agricultural lime. Example 2. Farmers try to provide optimal growing conditions for crops by using soil additives to adjust soil pH. One way to raise the pH of the soil is an additive made from pulverized chalk called garden lime or agricultural limestone. Agricultural limestone is often added to naturally acidic soils such as clay soil. All right, which is your preference? So we'll take a moment. Feel free to share in the chat, and in a moment I'll poll the room. Right, so we have some preferences emerging in the chat. I'll poll the room. Preference for the first example, preference for the second example. Okay, we have another pretty strong or even universal trend. What's accounting for that preference? It's the same information in both examples, right? Basically identical information. So why are we pulling toward the second example?
I like the flow of the second one better, it's kind of easier to follow.
Mhm.
Like even knowing that it introduces one way to raise it is this, I know exactly what I'm about to read.
So the sense of flow.
Yeah, to like elaborate, each, like the end, like the sentence topic flows into the next one because like the first sentence is number two talks about soil pH, and then the next one begins with soil pH. So since it begins with the same idea that the previous sentence ended with, then you can.
Yeah. I feel like I've planted both of you in order to articulate what's going on here. This is fantastic, right? So what we're going to look at is this connection between sentences. So what we're going to be looking at is it's a technique referred to as the old new information technique. Very, very popular structure in the English language. And it speaks to that distance between shared information between a preceding sentence and the sentence that follows. And what we see is a structure in the second example where we just have less distance between that shared information. So the concept of the old new information technique, it's a pretty simple concept. It's recognizing that if you are building on your sentences, one of the ways in which you can make the connection between those sentences more obvious to your reader is to foreground the shared information at the beginning of your next sentence. And this can help establish a sense of flow in our writing. And one of the reasons why I really like talking about this technique as well is that there's a lot of built-in flexibility because it's not just about replicating actual phrasing. There's flexibility that you can apply this structure in ways where you can still have some variety in your language. So one option is to use this structure, but use the phrasing of this or these plus a noun so that you're not necessarily having to repeat all of the same information. So for instance, Stipes and Wilson found that short bursts of intense exercise showed more benefits than longer but less intense workouts. This finding is consistent with those of other researchers. So this phrasing, this finding, is a way to very quickly make reference to the information in that previous sentence without having to replicate all of that content, which could then lead to wordier writing. So it can be a very efficient way to have that structure in place without requiring a lot of additional vocabulary. Now, one thing you want to be mindful of is the presence of that noun, because some people will make use of this or these or even it, but they won't have the noun, and that can lead to some potential ambiguity. Now, so we have a couple of different ways in which we can apply this technique. So we've seen the strategic repetition. Most people prefer cats to dogs. Cats are preferred for several reasons. So the phrasing is almost identical. It's not 100% identical, but we have, cats and this notion of preference just expressed in a slightly different conjugation. And it makes the connection between those two sentences really, really obvious. The next instance, you can make use of paraphrase or synonym use. They may be valued in part because of their inquisitive nature. A cat's curiosity, however, can create challenges for its owners. Inquisitive nature and cat's curiosity, those are pretty comparable concepts. And again, it's helping to reinforce the connection between those sentences without relying on the exact same phrasing. And then the example that we just saw a moment ago, the this or these plus a noun. It is estimated that pet ownership accounts for $2 billion in consumer spending annually. This outlay reflects the evolving relationship humans have with companion animals. So very, very useful structure that you can use to sustain the writing of entire paragraphs. And as you become more and more attuned to this structure and deliberate in its application, it can be a very useful practice for verifying that you actually have an awareness of how the sentences are linking together. So when you're revising, if you're starting to wonder like, is the connection between this sentence and this sentence, is that clear enough? Using this structure can help to clarify for yourself yes, this is the relationship. It might be that in going through that process, you'll realize, oh, actually, I think I'm missing a sentence. Like I need a bridge between these two sentences because I've jumped too far ahead. These sentences don't actually relate closely enough to each other. Another aspect of flow relates to parallelism. And this is a recognition that when you have elements that have equal conceptual weight in a sentence, you want to present them in a comparable grammatical structure. And if you fail to do this, it actually does result in a grammatical error known as faulty parallelism. But from a style perspective, it's just very useful for thinking about how you can balance comparable information in your sentences to ensure that your readers are experiencing that nice flow when they are reading. And I know that predictability is not necessarily the most exciting thing to talk about when we're talking about writing, but in a scientific context or an academic writing context, you want people to really focus on the ideas and not get distracted by the writing itself, right? So even though we all want to develop our academic voice, our scholarly voice when writing, sometimes notions of predictability can actually serve our readers in the way that they need because they just want to focus on the content. So here we have an example of some parallel structures in practice. This is from an article entitled Exotic European Earthworm Invasion Dynamics in Northern Hardwood Forests of Minnesota. And it reads as follows. 3 broad ecological groups have been described, including epigeic species, which live and feed exclusively in the litter layer, endogenic species, which live and feed in the mineral soil horizon, and anisic species, which burrow deeply but feed primarily on fresh surface litter. So when we deconstruct this, we'll see that it's not 100% parallel. We have a disruption, especially toward the end. But when we have a disruption that we can't avoid, if it's at the end of the sentence, readers are going to usually tolerate that a lot better because they're not being distracted mid-read. But when we look at this, we have an expectation being set up from the very beginning. There's reference to 3 groups. And often as a reader, we're then anticipating, okay, you're going to make reference to these 3. And as we read, that expectation is fulfilled, which tends to make us quite happy as readers. So we have species 1, species 2, species 3. So our framework is sort of being fulfilled in the way that we wanted. And then we have these details, and this is where there has been quite a lot of consideration to how that detail is being balanced. So we have a function word followed by 2 verbs, followed by reference to location. So we have which, live and feed, which live and feed, which burrow deeply but feed. So we have the greatest disruption at the end, but because we've gotten to the end, we're more tolerant of that disruption. So when you have these complex lists that you're trying to capture in prose, being aware of the need to maintain parallel structures is essential for ensuring that your readers aren't getting distracted by unparalleled elements. All right, let's continue. Which do you prefer, 1 or 2? Scientists recently used computer programs to show how some plant species have become common when rabbits and deer are prevented from accessing forests. Example 2, scientists recently utilized computer models to highlight how certain angiosperms become dominant in frequency when mammalian herbivores are preferentially excluded from gaining access to forest habitats. So we'll just let people have a moment to reflect and share. I just have to keep an eye on the time. I might have to speed up the pace a little bit. So I'll poll the room. Preference for 1 or 2? 1? 1? 2? Uncertain? 2? Okay, yeah. And I will acknowledge this is one of the examples where people will debate me. And I'm always open to that. I'm always open to it. But for those of you who prefer number one, what's accounting for that preference?
It's more open to people who maybe aren't so scientifically read, I guess.
So there's a potential for a broader readership, right? We have less specialized terminology. And it looks like you want to elaborate on why that might be an issue.
Yeah, because it's not just accounting for people who don't or not into science, but it's also more accessible for kids and children. Anyone understands what a forest is, like, but what is a habitat, you know? If they're not there yet, they can still understand what's happening in number one. The idea isn't complicated, but what is it?
Yeah, and so a lot of people will indicate that first one because it is easier to understand for the vast majority of us. Where I will sometimes receive pushback from folks in the room will be, well, actually, we need the specialized terminology, right? And this is one of those considerations you always have to make. Yeah.
If you need the specialized terminology, you should probably define it beforehand, and then you get the best both
That's
worlds.
gonna be a lot of definition.
At a certain point, you have to just expect that your readers, like, certain topics are beyond certain people if you don't have the proper background.
I do know some literary papers that actually do have like a definition page before, which is what you would probably do in this case, to be like, these are the important words you need to know.
Yeah, and so there are different ways in which we can conceptualize and support our readers. So it might be that we might provide definitions in text or as a supplementary document, or we might have an expectation that I'm writing for a particular audience, and they're going to be, there's an expectation that they're going to have access to this kind of vocabulary. When I'm looking at this example, though, it really is to help us reflect on what at times questionable expectations we might have about communication in academia and science, where are we unintentionally reinforcing barriers to information? And so when we have instances where we can actually use a simpler term and it's not going to distort the science or the information, why not opt for the simpler term? So you might argue, well, actually, like some of these words, I would prefer to use the more specialized terminology. But if you're able to flip 50% to simpler language, that's going to not just make it more accessible to maybe an interdisciplinary researcher who might be accessing your work, but also the specialized readers that you are targeting, because we all like writing that is easier to access and understand. So this is from an article entitled "The Top 10 Reasons Why Manuscripts Are Not Accepted for Publication." And provides a little bit of insight into why you might want to consider a relationship with some of the language choices we are making. Some authors may apparently believe that they must impress the reader with their erudition and mastery of multisyllabic words in order for their work to be given the appreciation it deserves. This is a mistaken notion. With scientific writing, the simplest and most direct statement of the intended message is always best. So we don't want to get caught up in this notion of like trying to appear intellectual or academic. We want to think about how will my reader access and interpret this information. So we have a lot of language that I think we fall back to in academia simply because this is the type of language we've been reading, but we can ask ourselves, can I just use a simpler word if it's going to mean the exact same thing, if it's not going to lead to any sort of misunderstanding of what I'm trying to communicate? So, for instance, a considerable amount of, could we just say many, right? This is something that we want to ask ourselves. Just want to be mindful of the time here. Let's continue. This is, I think we have like 2 more examples. Exposure to test compounds for several days is commonly used to determine if they cause an inhibition of cell proliferation. Example 2, cells are often exposed to test compounds for several days to determine if the compounds inhibit cell proliferation. Because we're low on time, I'm just going to poll the room quite quickly. What is your preference, 1 or 2? But feel free to note in the chat as well. 1, 2. Okay, so we have a preference for 2, both in the room and online. What's accounting for that preference? Yes.
I feel like the information in number 1 is presented backwards.
Mm.
In number 2, it's flipped around, and it makes more sense that way.
Mhm.
Because that's also like the order that you'd like do it in.
Mhm.
Because like when you're thinking about doing the experiment, is you expose the things to test compounds to determine if this,
Mhm.
but you don't expose it, and it's commonly used to determine. Like it's just backwards.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it seems kind of backwards. And what we're looking at here is, we're sort of looking at 2 things. We're looking at issues to do with what are referred to as zombie nouns, or nominalized language. And we're also looking at the difference between a passive structure and an active structure. And one of the issues with reliance on zombie nouns is that sometimes it pushes our structures to be more passive in the writing compared with foregrounding clear nouns that are then carrying out the action in the sentence. So if you're not familiar with the concept of zombie nouns or nominalized language, basically in English, we have a selection of words that can exist either as a verb or a noun. And what happens is sometimes we will, so sometimes we'll use the noun instead of the verb form. And what this does is it requires that we add more information into the sentence for it to make sense. Because grammatically it requires support. And that's why we refer to them as these zombie nouns, because they're lifeless. They need this kind of support. So rather than use the noun form, flipping it to the verb form can help us a lot in terms of making sentences more active and easier to understand. So just a quick refresher of active versus passive sentences. Active sentences, the subject is the doer of action. So for example, the experiment shows inconclusive results versus the passive where the subject receives the action. Inconclusive results were the finding of the experiment. And we certainly saw that in the previous example where it's sort of reverses the emphasis in the sentence. Now, there's a lot of editorial preference for active sentences in the scientific writing community. So Nature, the National Academy of Sciences, Science as far back as the 1960s, they've indicated preference for active language when possible because they recognize that it's easier for readers to understand. Now, that's not to say that we can't use passive sentences. Sometimes we have to. It can be useful to communicate a sense of objectivity. So for example, dogs were used to produce insulin in the early 1920s, or if the subject is not known or obvious, the laboratory was vandalized. We don't know by who, right? It's a great mystery. And also sometimes it can be a little bit exhausting for a reader if every single sentence is an active sentence. So sometimes passive sentences will just break that up a little bit. Okay, now start wrapping up a little bit. Revision is key to all writing, and it's especially key in academic writing. So don't believe me. I have a quote here. When I write a scientific paper, I complete a final draft and then shorten it by as much as a third, right? And I resonate with this. I'm a wordy writer. I know that about myself. So my first couple of drafts are usually pretty wordy, and then I'll have to go through and revise with the intention of reducing some of that language. So as we are going through our revision process, we can have either a physical or mental checklist that we can work with. And so we can ask ourselves, are my subjects too long? Can my ideas be made more concrete? Should we add definitions or examples? What about flow? Should we use the old new information technique? Can we structure information in a parallel way? Is it too wordy? Can we reduce some of those unnecessary words or phrases? If I'm relying on a lot of zombie nouns, can I convert those nouns to stronger verbs? Okay, all right, well, we're at the end. So there are so many great resources out there if you want to dig into this topic. And I would encourage you to explore any that seem of interest to you. I've attached a little brief insight following each of the citations or the references rather, just so that you have a sense of why you might access it in the first place. And there are a ton that you can check out. If you are familiar with any of Cormac McCarthy's books, novels that he wrote, he actually worked for the Santa Fe Institute, which is like a scientific institute for, gosh, I think he was in residence for like 20 years, and he helped scientists with their writing. So he has some interesting insights, or he did, because he has since died. All right. So general takeaways. Keep track of the writers in your field whose writing you admire, right? Hopefully you're going to encounter a handful of these through your studies, and you can keep track of them and study how they're approaching their writing, because they're making choices in the same way that any writer makes choices. So if you find that someone, or that there are a couple of people whose writing you just find clear, compelling, interesting to read, well, what kind of choices are they making? Because you can make similar choices in your own writing. And then you can be very intentional in using certain strategies for improving the clarity of your writing as well. All right, I apologize for being a little bit rushed toward the end, but we did it with 1 minute to spare. But I'm happy to stick around if there are questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for your contributions online and your contributions in the room. And as always, happy writing.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just want to mention a couple more workshops coming up next week. Top 5 research tips. We'll be doing the storytelling competition information session. That's on Wednesday, so come to that and ask all your questions and find out what that competition's all about and the timelines around it, and the workshops associated with it. That should be a fun one as always. And then on Thursday, introduction to Zotero and Research Rabbit for literature mapping software. Those are really, really awesome tools for pulling information together, for writing, for it. They're just so useful. So highly recommend that one if you're looking to start to pull together literature and wanting to organize it in such a way that you can actually use it in your writing and get back to it and remember where everything was and make notes and all the things.
I'm a very recent convert to Zotero.
Yeah.
I've yet to explore its full capabilities, because I am of an age where we didn't really have this stuff when I went through graduate school,
Yeah.
Let alone undergrad. And so like the notion of research management software, I'm like, okay, like I have all of my paper documents and electronic files, all that kind of stuff. But I challenged myself for a course I was taking last term to try Zotero. And I thought, oh my goodness, people are so lucky now.
So, as someone who did their master's degree in 2000, finished their master's degree in 2009, and I'm now doing my Ed.D. And working through that right now, highly recommend the new tools.
Yeah.
So awesome. And Research Rabbit just is such a great way to expand your literature review and find those articles without having to sort of go through bibliographies of a million different and look and read a million abstracts and go, is this? No, that is not. Okay, is this?
Yeah,
No,
and just being able to conceptualize themes.
visually.
Yeah, in a way that like they would emerge regardless of how you get there, but being able to start to see that as you're in the process as
Speeds
opposed
it up.
to, yeah, it's
So good.
yeah. So
Okay.
knowledge is power, people.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, folks.
Right, should we just shut this?
Can we just see what went wrong with the clicker? This
Yeah.
way I learn for next time. Grab some snacks when you're out, guys.